Right, should we make a start? Welcome to the first All-Star seminar of the term. It is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Malcolm Thorburn. Malcolm is Professor of Law at the University of Toronto. He writes on a range of kind of issues around criminal justice and public law, including criminal law and procedure, sentencing, policing, proportionality. He is the editor of the Philosophical Foundations of Constitutional Law and the Dignity of Law, and he's here today to talk to us about what kind of order we want. So you're very welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can everyone hear me at the back? Great. So
I'm just worried that your wonderful PowerPoint slides won't be. We have this
On any way.
really low screen.
Is it possible to raise it? Or should I sit to one side?
It depends, but it's up to you.
Can we raise it?
No, we can't, but you can sort of sit a little bit.
Depends how we touch on the sides again.
I might sit behind the screen. That sounds plausibly like they're coming from there. Well, I think that should be better, and I have a little here. So a word of preface before I begin. So as Ian said, I'm a professor of criminal law, and I work as a legal theory as it applies to criminal justice in a variety of ways. So another way of saying the same thing is that I am not a criminologist. And so I come here with some ideas, and part of what I'm trying to do is bring to bear some ideas which I think among criminologists are kind of received wisdom, and seeing what import they might have to kind of a theoretical picture of this area. So insofar as you have more to tell me about any of these questions, I'm delighted to hear from you. So this is really just a oh, and one other thing about the project itself is this is the beginning of a project which started just as a small article on kind of a philosophy article about policing. It is now turning into something more, I think. So I hope you'll notice that the end of the presentation is really more of a series of questions and provocations than anything. So again, I'm delighted to hear your views on all of this. Okay, so in the last few years, criminologists, legal scholars, and the general public across the English-speaking world have been quite absorbed by questions of police governance. Part of this, I suppose, is the larger international debate about defunding the police that swept the English-speaking world in the months following the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. But much of that defund the police debate was about the very existence of the police and whether they were irredeemable and ought to be replaced entirely by other public institutions. As we've seen in the ensuing years, the defund movement, I think, has lost a lot of its steam and has indeed been abandoned, I think, by a lot of progressive leaders. So that's not what I'm going to be talking about. In Canada, a narrower question of police governance has taken over in the past few years. I don't know if there are any other Canadians in the room. If so, I apologize for telling you things you already know. But part of this is framed in the context of some Canadian questions. So rather than the abolition of the police altogether or their defunding, the question that has gripped us is our sclerotic governance structures for policing. So two incidents to illustrate this. See this is a young Indigenous man by the name of Dudley George. And so this is a story from a few years ago, 1995. This was a story that I think illustrates the dangers of what I would call American-style partisan political control over the police. Dudley George and a small group of Ojibwe men occupied a portion of a provincial park in Ontario called Ipperwash, demanding the return of lands that had been expropriated from them during the Second World War. The Premier of Ontario at the time, a man by the name of Michael Harris, was incensed at the occupation and was reported by his Attorney General and a few other witnesses, although he denies having said it, to have demanded of the chief of the provincial police, quote, "I want those fucking Indians out of the park," he said. And the very next day, the Ontario Provincial Police confronted the protesters quite aggressively. And when Dudley George waved a stick at them, a police officer shot him and killed him. During a subsequent public inquiry, there was a great deal of discussion as to whether the premier actually given this improper direction, and if he did, whether it was in fact a causal explanation for the killing. But one thing is clear in the larger discussion, it was a reminder that we were not interested in having direct political control over specific issues of investigation of this kind. That's one story. Now another, from much more recently, just 2 years ago, illustrates, perhaps not perfectly, but illustrates to some extent the dangers of another sort of polar opposite concern. So in the winter of 2022, which was a cold winter, Canada, in January, there was a fairly small group of protesters who drove to our national capital, Ottawa, called themselves the Freedom Convoy, and shut down the city. How did they do so? Well, they parked a number of very large tractor trailers on the streets, preventing the circulation of traffic. And they then expanded this to all kinds of other semi-permanent installations, which blocked off civic life on quite a large portion of the city. So they also, as part of their protest, use the horns on their trucks, which are very loud, day and night. So this prevented people from getting around the city. It prevented ambulances from picking people up and taking them to hospital. It prevented children from getting to school. And of course, the main occupation was in front of the Parliament buildings, and it prevented the federal government from doing many of its operations at the time. Now, in response to this, what did we do? Well, not much. The Premier of Ontario, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Federal Minister of Emergency Preparedness, the Provincial Solicitor General all repeated the same line when asked by the media what to do. This is a police matter. The police are independent of political control. Government can't do anything to direct them about what to do. So some enterprising citizens took it upon themselves, Canadian style, to deal with the problem. They secured injunctions prohibiting the making of excessive noise. But for several weeks, that was pretty much it. It was only after about 3.5 weeks that finally the occupation was removed by a coordinated response from quite a number of police forces. And that was the end of it. But what we saw was there was this thought in the back of everyone's mind that somehow policing is something that the police are to do entirely independently of political control. And I think both of these ideas, that somehow the premier can say, remove these people immediately, or we have nothing to say, are in some ways caricatures. And so I understand that. But I think they give us a sense of part of what's so problematic with the debate in Canada on these questions is it, at least on some of these incidents, has lacked any subtlety. So we've seen in very dramatic fashion these two extreme views about police governance, where the police simply act at the direct behest of our political leaders. This can easily make the police tools of partisan political interests, sometimes very dangerously. And even when public order more generally is broken down, sometimes our political leaders are afraid to do anything, thinking that this is going to lead to partisan control of the police. So what are we to do? Well, the lazy answer is, and this is the answer every Canadian gives to every question, we should do something between the two extremes, right? Let's split the difference. Maybe some political interference, not too much. So in broad brushstrokes, I suppose that's true, but that doesn't really tell us anything interesting, right? The devil is in the details. So some scholars have called for Canada to adopt something like the Police and Crime Commissioners structure that the England and Wales adopted, I guess, 2012, directly elected, where they can set policies and budgets for local departments. Now, the English experiment, I call it an experiment, so I guess it's still fairly new. The jury, from what I'm told, is still out, at least in some people's minds, although I'd love to hear from all of you more about that, whether we really should adopt something like it. But we need to come up with something other than what we've got. So I've structured this talk in 4 parts. So in the first, I want to look a little bit more about the normative foundations of these 2 views about the relationship between the police and our elected public officials. This quasi-judicial independence view, which has its roots here in England, and then the full-throated democratic control model, which has its origins, at least in the English-speaking world, in the US. Second, I'll consider and then reject a common defense of police independence based on their expertise in crime fighting. So in the United States, this has been, I think, the most powerful tool the police have wielded to shield themselves from political interference. So I think the argument goes something like this. Policing is all about crime control. Crime control is a technical question of expertise. Politicians should leave the police, who are the experts, to sort it out for themselves. I reject this argument on the grounds that, as I suspect all of you and most criminologists know, policing is not just a technical field dealing just with crime control. A more accurate description of the police mission is that they are but one of the state's tools, along with many others, for bringing about a certain conception of public order. They're different from these other state instruments, not in their ends, but in their peculiar means. And this is not surprisingly connected with their ability to issue commands and to enforce them with coercion. Third, I put forward the idea of public office as the best way to think about the interaction between democratic input and police independence. So the worries raised about undue political interference on the one hand and insufficient public input on the other, I think are really 2 aspects of the same fundamental concern. Policing is a public good, and that means that decisions about policing should be made in the name of the public as a whole. Sometimes the nature of policing as a public office calls for democratic decision-making in the setting of the terms of that office, setting police purposes, permissible means, budget, and so on. That's how we together can decide on the kind of order we want and the acceptable means of getting it. But the nature of policing as a public office also means that the application of these general principles to particular situations is something that should be undertaken by public office holders whose decisions are properly subject to the public law standards of impartiality, reasonableness, and so on, inherent in their public office. So calls for more democracy and calls for more impartiality and administrative review, I think, in some way stem from the same basic concern. And then finally, in the 4th part, I'll suggest that there's yet another role for public input in policing beyond the setting of police purposes and permissible means. Because the police are properly conceived of not as the sole experts in crime fighting, but as one institution among many focused on realizing this shared public order, this tells us something else important about the nature of their office. So the purposes of police overlap with the purposes of many other public offices, such as health, education, childcare, and housing. And there will be situations where policing must be coordinated in real time with the efforts of other public offices. So political leaders will have a role to play, not only in setting purposes, means, and so on, but also an ongoing role in coordinating efforts of various public bodies in bringing about the kind of public order we want. So in the common law world, there's a long history of deference to the police on all manner of questions. I know that things changed in England and Wales considerably in 2012, but I want to step back for a moment to consider the long tradition of police independence that dominated here for at least a couple of centuries. So in England and Wales and in much of the Commonwealth, including Canada, the history of this attitude toward police governance goes back at least as far as the founding of the Met in the early 19th century. We can see this attitude, I think, set out nicely in the 5th of the so-called Peelian principles of policing. So-called, I suppose you all know, because I think it's Not at all clear that these actually were written by Prime Minister Peel, but were perhaps inspired by things he had said by way of instruction. In any case, so here's part of principle number 5, as it's often quoted: to seek and preserve public favor, not by pandering to public opinion, but by constantly demonstrating absolutely impartial service to law in complete independence of policy and without regard to the justice or injustice of the substance of individual laws. So when then that was founded in 1829, the office of Commissioner of Police was that of a justice of the peace appointed to administer the new police force. So that is, control of policing from its early 19th century origins in England was under the control of a quasi-judicial officer. The thought then was that the Commissioner of Police should have something like the sort of independence we grant to judges. So like judges, they should ignore government policies and simply enforce the law impartially, independently. This quasi-judicial idea of policing, that it's answerable to magistrates, not to elected politicians, was widely accepted in colonial Canada also from early on. Again, something I suspect you're familiar with. It was this quasi-judicial concept of police independence that was so forcefully endorsed by Lord Denning in his famous judgment ex parte Blackburn. So according to Denning, he says, "I have no hesitation in holding that, like every constable in the land, the Commissioner of Police of the metropolis should be and is independent of the executive. I hold it to be his task, as it is of every chief constable, to enforce the law of the land. He must take steps to post his men so that crimes may be detected, and that honest citizens may go about their affairs in peace. In all these things, he is not the servant of anyone save the law itself." Now, Lord Denning's reasons tell us quite a lot about what sorts of reasons the Commissioner of Police should not advert to. He should remain entirely independent of government policy in setting his priorities. But what should govern his thinking in these matters? To say that the police brass are not the servants of anyone save the law itself sounds very grand, but it doesn't tell us anything about what considerations should guide the police when making decisions about investigation, charging, or much of anything else. What does the law tell the police about how to allocate police resources? Unless we live in what I think is a fantasy world where the police should investigate and prosecute every crime, the law is radically indeterminate as a guide to policing policy. Slightly more helpful, perhaps, is Lord Denning's reference to the Commissioner of Police posting his men so that honest men may go about their affairs in peace. This suggests that the Commissioner ought to think about how to preserve the peace for honest men, or at least one guiding purpose in such investigation and charging decisions. But that's extremely thin policy guidance indeed. But that's not all. We've had 2 prime ministers named Trudeau. This is the elder, not the one we have now. It was Trudeau père, not Trudeau fils. Okay. So in Canada, this doctrine of police independence has been interpreted even more widely than what we see from Peel's 5th Principle or from ex parte Blackburn. So Prime Minister Trudeau insisted that the doctrine required not only that the police should be free of political interference, but even that political leaders should remain in ignorance of what the police are doing. So here's a quotation from him. "Politicians who happen to form the government should be kept in ignorance of the day-to-day operations of the police force and even of the security force. It is a matter of stating as a principle the particular minister of the day should not have a right to know what the police are doing in their investigative practices, what they are looking at, what they are looking for, and in the way in which they are doing it. That," he says, "is our position." So in all these quotations, from Peel's principles to Lord Denning's reasons in ex parte Blackburn to Prime Minister Trudeau's comments about police investigations, there's always a general reference to police independence from any policies of the government of the day. And usually this is restricted to questions of police investigation and day-to-day operations. As I've mentioned already, the idea that the police should govern their day-to-day operations without any sense of what policy to pursue is already quite mysterious. But it's downright dangerous when this attitude is applied across the board to all police operations, such as the weeks-long occupation of our national capital, my national capital. We've endorsed as a matter of principle that the police should make decisions of enormous import about the shape of our shared public order entirely on their own and without any public input. So the result is, in Canada, that, as my colleague in Toronto, Kent Roach, has complained, Canada has a dangerous democratic deficit in policing, one that essentially allows the police to govern themselves. Now, whereas the old style English and maybe even contemporary Canadian police were established under the direction of magistrates with quasi-judicial independence, the situation has always been very different in the United States. In the much celebrated tradition of local democracy there, urban and rural police departments alike have always been answerable to the policy of elected officials of the day. Of course, it's difficult to generalize about policing in a country where there are almost 18,000 police agencies. 18,000, that's a lot. But some clear trends emerge. So in cities, police departments are much larger and better organized than in small towns in the countryside. Roughly half of all police departments in the United States, about 9,000 of them, have fewer than 10 full-time employees. So governance is a kind of a theoretical proposition, I guess. But in cities, police policy, from grand strategy down to quite fine-grained detail, is generally set out by the elected mayor, and these policies are often the subject of considerable electoral campaign debate. And this guy, you may recognize him. He was in the front page of the newspaper facing prosecution in Arizona today, Rudy Giuliani. But before he was Trump's man in Arizona, he was the mayor of New York City. He was elected in 1994, largely, or at least in some significant measure, on the strength of his policies about policing. He was a great advocate, at least of his interpretation of broken windows policing, and he appointed William Bratton to run the force there. There was no suggestion that Bratton should be entirely independent of the mayor's influence on matters of police policy, large or small. Now, in smaller centers, police departments are often headed by elected sheriffs. And there, the question of whether they are answerable to anyone else is, in some sense, not really the question, because they are themselves elected officials. Right? So here, too, they transparently campaign on specific policing policies and are anticipating the next election as they're doing their jobs. So the traditional American democratic partisan policing model then can serve as a nice foil to the English or Canadian tradition of quasi-judicial independence. Whereas we can see the chief of police as a magistrate impartially administering the law, the US tradition is very clear that policing is about policy choices all the way down, and those policy choices should be made democratically, locally, by electing mayors or sheriffs directly. Now, not surprisingly, there are some downsides to that kind of democratic control. There's been no end to corruption scandals in US policing over the years. This is just one of many places you can find these descriptions. So in virtually every large US jurisdiction, as well as many small ones, police have at one time or another been improperly influenced by partisan politics or simply by crooks who have used political office as a means for accumulating personal wealth, right? And this is precisely the worry about equal application of the law that animated the English insistence on policing as a sort of magistracy with quasi-judicial independence. Now, it would be misleading, it would be very misleading if I were to suggest that this full-throated embrace of local democracy and policing just is the story about policing in the United States today. Although American policing was often run according to this radical democratic principle in the 19th century, since the beginning of the 20th century, many police chiefs have actively promoted an ideal of police professionalism as a way of combating this sort of political interference with their mission. So legal historian Sarah Seo dates this movement to the turn of the 20th century, and in particular to this man, August Vollmer, the chief of police in Berkeley, California. So he's sometimes referred to as the father of modern policing in the US. And he boasted that, quote, "The modern police department is an up-to-date business institution, conducting its affairs on a solid business basis to the fullest extent, utilizing principles of the several sciences and gradually developing principles peculiar to police service." That is, in the absence of a constitutional idea of police independence, many American police chiefs have looked to a very practical, pragmatic reason to keep politicians out of policing, and that is expertise. For better or for worse. So in short, there's two radically different traditions that we can look to. These are caricatures, if you want a more high-minded way, let's call them ideal types. But they are most definitely not fine-grained detailed pictures yet of where we should be going here. But I hope at least that they highlight some pitfalls and maybe something valuable in each. So we can't say much that's useful about how policing should be governed until we have a clearer sense of what the task of policing is about. What is it that we're governing? So we need to look a good deal more closely at what sorts of activities police typically carry out, what purposes they promote, what powers they have to carry all this out. And there appears to be a very large divide on this question between sociologists, criminologists on the one hand, and people like me who teach in law schools, and politicians and the general public on the other. So among sociologists and criminologists, I think there's very broad agreement, might even be a platitude at this point, that policing is not just concerned with enforcing the criminal law. Ever since the police became an object of serious sociological study back in the mid-20th century, it's been widely recognized that on whatever measure you might choose, policing is mostly concerned with matters other than the enforcement of criminal law. The police officers spend a small amount of their time in activities related to criminal law enforcement. They're not required to pursue every suspected case of criminal wrongdoing. And although maybe this last point is slightly more controversial, it's not clear that the police have much effect on crime levels either. Now, that's, I know, a subject of some debate these days, but couple of rather dated references here in the sociological literature, but this is one that we criminal lawyers still come back to a lot. Egon Bittner's line from this famous article, Florence Nightingale in Pursuit of Willie Sutton. "A vastly preponderant number of policemen are assigned to activities in which they have virtually no opportunities for criminal law enforcement, and the available data indicate that they are engaged in it with a frequency that surely casts doubt upon the belief that this is in the substance or even the core of their mandate," he wrote. Now, however clear and subtle the agreement might be among criminologists and sociologists, the message has not gotten out to us lawyers, or to politicians or to the general public, I think. I think it remains the case that law enforcement is often used as a synonym for policing. The promise of police chiefs and many politicians is to reduce crime through policing, concentrating on their core mission of crime control. Often the key metrics by which policing is measured have to do with crime rates. And the premise of all this is that the police are on one side in an ongoing war between cops and robbers. One of my children's favorite children's books. Yeah. But David Bailey points out, and this I guess is one of the interventions in the literature. There's a lots going rejoinders to this, but his view, right? The police do not prevent crime. They pretend that they do, but it's a myth, he suggests. Now, whether or not you agree with Bailey all the way down on this point, it's certainly true that many police chiefs have used crime prevention as a means for selling the product. So Chief William Parker of the LAPD wrote, "The vital elements of our civilized life, including our most sacred institutions, at one time or another have been laboriously sold to the public. We must do the same." New York Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, this picture I had up a moment ago, very explicitly took credit for the rapid drop in crime rates in New York City. This was his article, "Crime Rates Are Falling, Blame the Police." Credit the police. In service of this message, he insisted that even if the police do engage in a variety of other measures, community outreach, assistance to the needy, and so on, they are all in service of this core defining mission of crime control. And A line that I'm sure you've all heard before. When Theresa May was still Home Secretary, she said in 2011, "I have given you to the police just one objective: cut crime." So there is this discussion still whether or not criminologists would buy into this at all. It's still this perception. But whatever police departments and ambitious Home Secretaries might like us to believe, police officers don't spend most of their time trying to catch criminals. So what are they doing? What should they be doing? This is the question on which historians of police seem to be in broad agreement with sociologists. So historians of the idea of policing will tell us that the idea of police, which the common law world imported from continental Europe in the late 18th century, was concerned with much more than the enforcement of the criminal law. And so Patrick Cahoon, right back in the late 18th century, talks about this idea of police in this much broader sense, really about everything to do with governance of cities, municipal regulations, paving, watching, lighting, cleaning, removing nuisances, furnishing water, the mode of building houses, and so on and so forth, right, are all part of this system of police. Now, this is, again, not novel, but I think important to put the pieces together in a certain way. So what distinguishes the modern police from all these other public institutions is not then its driving purpose, but its assigned means. So all these diverse aspects of the police are directed toward the construction of a shared public order in which we can all go about our lives in community with others in some way. So we divide up this task into lots of subtasks, providing essential public goods like roads or public lighting or water and fire services, creating regulations to ensure the safety in the workplace or roads or elsewhere and so on. And policing in the narrow sense fits into this scheme not because of any distinctive purpose, but because it contributes to this shared effort through a distinctive sort of means. And I have a picture of someone who's already in the room. There we go, that fellow, right? Actually, pretty good likeness. It's raining. Yes. So here's Ian's summary, right? Dealing with crime forms one aspect of an omnibus police role that's better interpreted as having to do with the regulation of social conflict and the management of order, in respect of which the police's unique resource is the capacity, if required, to wield non-negotiable coercive force. So at first blush, then you might think, the American approach is the right one. There's no such thing as a neutral application of the laws, as the Peel's principle number 5 or Lord Denning's reasons in Ex parte Blackburn might seem to suggest. There's endless choices to be made about the use of police resources. We simply cannot pretend that this is a quasi-judicial task that can be applied simply by looking at criminal law. What's more, the move that many American police chiefs have tried to limit the power of democratic oversight, to insist that their defining mission is one of technical expertise where politicians have no place, is also a loser of an argument. The police are not just a crime-fighting instrument, and they don't have a special expertise in carrying that out. They are concerned with the same fundamentally political problem as many other areas of civic life, setting and maintaining the basic terms under which we can go about living our lives in community with others. So very today's dated reference, but here is there we are, Lawrence Lustgarten. Not here today, but right, his many years ago said something which in those days I guess was shocking, but is certainly not now. Policing is politics, just as taxation and education are politics. So as a negative claim, that's 100% right. It's ridiculous to insist that policing could be undertaken as a quasi-judicial function entirely independent of policy. They need to make all these decisions, as we said, all of which require policy input. To say that we must make these decisions simply as servants to the law and the law alone can't be right. So as a negative claim, great. But as a positive claim, this insistence that policing is politics is just really an invitation to say more, right, about what sort of politics is appropriate, about what questions, how is it to be circumscribed by the rule of law, constitutional considerations, and so on, right? the American tradition of local democracy about policing is one option with a long history, but it's certainly not the only one that recognizes this political quality. So if we recognize that policing is politics, we need not jettison everything about the traditional English quasi-judicial approach. In fact, the cursory examination of the American tradition of local democracy that I've just been talking about has already shown some idea of police independence is incredibly valuable. The one valuable part of that traditional police independence story is that non-partisanship is a fundamental aspect of policing. So if policing becomes an instrument of partisan politics, it will be its undoing in a couple of ways. So first, as Tom Tyler and other sociologists have pointed out, much of the power of the police to do anything comes not from brute force, but from their perceived legitimacy among members of the public. So where the police are seen as instruments of one partisan interest or another, it undermines their effectiveness in securing public order. Now, this first consideration is about effectiveness, but there's a second worry, which is becoming, getting a lot of attention these days, where political philosophers, certainly in North America, are worrying a lot more about kind of normative legitimacy of policing. And there too, non-partisanship plays an important role. This second legitimacy has to do not only with whether the police can carry out their mission, but whether they have the standing to do so. If the police really are just taking their orders from a particular group of elected politicians and come what may, then whatever the democratic mandate those politicians might have, the police becoming their tool can quickly become their tool of one group against another. So all the worries about the tyranny of the majority become very concrete very quickly. You see this, again, the American literature on policing is heavy on the skepticism about police on a lot of things, but for good reason, right? So the history of Jim Crow America, right, where police power was very much used to entrench the power of the white elites over the disenfranchised Black population. You see that this was true of much of Europe also, where there was a police being used in a kind of class struggle as well. And it is certainly true in Canada and any other settler state where our police have long been used as a tool of the settler project as well. And the racial dimensions are very much on the surface, something that is very much part of our debate right now in policing in Canada. And of course, the fact that the victim in the very first case I talked about is Indigenous is not an accident. So the legitimacy of policing power is not just a matter of winning elections, right? Legitimate policing must be genuinely public in some deeper sense. And that means that the ideal of non-partisan application of police policy by public officials is an essential part of that story. But the demand for democratic legitimacy, that the police act in the collective name of us all, is also a pressing demand. So for too long in Canada and other countries in the English tradition, the police have been able to make and implement their own policies on grounds of police independence. So if the police are acting in good faith, they're just left without guidance. And if they're acting in bad faith, then this grants them unrestrained power to pursue their own interests in their policing. The best way, I think, to capture the structure of this problem, and perhaps, I hope, the best hope for its solution, is, I think, with an idea of public office. So this might seem like a surprising suggestion given what I've just been saying, but didn't I just take the first, 10, 15 minutes of my presentation talking about this old-fashioned English conception of policing as a quasi-judicial office as problematic? And I will stick to that. That is, if that is a failed conception of policing that doesn't give the police any guidance, there's something I need to say something more about this idea of public office. It isn't the idea of public office that Lord Denning and Peel's principles were pushing. Public offices come in several different flavors. So Peel's principle, ex parte Blackburn, and so on, see policing as part of effectively the judicial branch of government. And like judges, they insist that the police should stand entirely apart from policy priorities, answerable only to the law itself. But there is another conception of office that is, I think, a much more helpful way of thinking about policing, and it's an office in the executive branch of government, in which case there is a separation between the office holder and her political masters, but the nature of that separation is distinctive. It's not the same distinction as we have in the judicial branch. So an executive branch office holder must, qua office holder, exercise her normative powers fairly reasonably impartially, not on her own behalf, but as a member of the executive branch, she emphatically should be concerned with the policy priorities that have been set out in the terms of her office. Indeed, it's the government's stated purposes through that mandate, along with policies and strategies that it has set out, that should guide the office holder in all that she does. Indeed, this focus on the office holder's reasons for action is a central defining feature in the idea of public office more broadly. Now, this idea of corruption in public office is an idea that's very fashionable now among political philosophers. Nico Kolodny and others have written about this, but also criminal law scholars like Jeremy Horder here in England. And they've seen that the core of this idea of corruption in public office is acting for the wrong reasons, acting for your own private reasons, rather than for the purposes, public purposes that define the mandate of your office. So this focus on purposes, and not just on answerable to the law, but there is a policy that's guiding you, but it is one that is set out in your mandate as an executive official. So this fundamental legal idea of public office is the way that we often try to square two aspects of public decision-making. On the one hand, a decision cannot count as genuinely public if it lacks democratic legitimacy. If a decision concerns a fundamentally public question, such as the nature and character of the public order we're all living in, then it must, at some level, be resolved through democratic means. The criminal law alone cannot tell us what sort of order we want. We need a democratic process to determine the structure of that shared public order and general principles. If we're to live under a genuinely public conception of public order, those principles must be applied in concrete cases by individuals who take those purposes, and only those purposes, as their guide when deciding how to act. So partisan local politicians don't fulfill that role. Independent public officials who are trained to occupy the public point of view and whose decisions are reviewable on public law grounds of fairness and reasonableness in their decision-making, I think, are a better hope for genuinely public policing. John Gardner, late fellow of this college and one of the greatest thinkers about philosophy of criminal law in a very, very long time, had some things to say about policing from his philosophical vantage point. And I think it may be useful to invoke that here. So he disagreed with me on the public nature of policing in a couple of articles he wrote. And his view was that policing is a morally distinctive role with a number of special obligations that attach to it. But, he argued, to be, so some of those are even-handedness, duty to protect, be the last line of defense. So on all of these, he saw as characteristic of the police role and not something that ordinary citizens have as or moral obligations. So being in this position is something separate. But he vehemently denied that there was something morally significant about the fact that police officers are public officials. Right? And he cited with approval the traditional English view about the police being citizens in uniform. So this is another field principles. The police are the public. You've probably heard this, and the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence. Now, I argued then, and I continue to insist now, that policing cannot be reduced to a set of tasks or moral obligations that anyone in principle could take up in the interests of community welfare and existence. The whole point is that the idea of policing is concerned with constructing and preserving a shared idea of public order that has democratic legitimacy and that is enforced in an even-handed way by public officials in the name of us all. So police officers, from the commissioner of police all the way down to the constable walking the beat, use powers, decision-making powers, the powers to give orders, the powers to use coercion, to require obedience to those orders, and so on, many of which are forbidden to you and me. In deciding how to use those powers, the police must make innumerable decisions every day about how best to promote this shared conception of public order. They do so not as private citizens and not as partisan politicians, but it sounds like a descriptive claim, it's obviously a normative one, as public officials doing their best to realize a purpose that we have crafted together. So one reading of Peel's principles is that they are trying to make sense of the idea of policing without the concept of public office that I'm invoking here. On the one hand, they insist that there's no fundamental difference between the police and members of the public. On the other hand, they insist that police officers are the most official of officials, quasi-judicial office that demands total independence of government policy. Now, the police do occupy a public office, I argue, but it's overkill and misleading to suggest that it's a quasi-judicial office. Judges should act in a way that is separate and independent of government policy. Their job is to decide legal questions on the basis of the law itself. Sure, we would be in trouble if they were really just trying to promote government policy. If they were to see themselves as instruments of the government of the day, we would lose a fundamental part of the rule of law. But the police are not like judges in that respect. When the police decide where to allocate resources, deciding when to enforce rules about the use of public space, whether to pursue an investigation, whether to bring charges against a particular suspect, and so on, they do so, and they most definitely should do so, considering whether doing so advances a conception of public order as set out in the policy purposes that define their office. So in short, they're not just members of the public pursuing their own purposes, nor are they impartial magistrates simply enforcing the law. They are advocates for our democratically agreed upon conception of public order. So Lord Denning himself, remember him, adverted to this idea obliquely when he mentioned that the police should use their powers to ensure that the honest citizen may go about their affairs in peace. The police should not prefer one criminal to another for partisan reasons, but they most definitely should focus more on some crimes rather than others if they are a greater threat to the existence or stability of the public order that allows, quote, honest citizens to go about their affairs in peace. Now, it should, of course, be citizens more generally, or indeed subjects or the population more generally. Citizenship is not crucial. Honesty is certainly not crucial, right? This is Lord Denning's language, not mine. And so, but what's interesting though is that he had some inkling, right? But if you can't just say enforce the law, right? There's clearly some inkling that there was some kind of policy guidance there, even if it was his rather arch-conservative view of what it was supposed to be. And he and his honest citizen friends are the ones whose interests you're supposed to promote. So we should think of the Commission of Police as occupying a public office then, but not a judicial one. So that's not all that difficult to imagine. So public offices are all about making decisions based upon a certain set of considerations. Private lawyers know all about this and the structure of trusts, right? So this is a trust asset does not belong to the trustee, and that's why the trustees can't make their own decisions about it as though it was their property, right? They have to make decisions. They do exercise discretion, but consistent with the terms of their trust, because it is something they're administering on someone else's behalf. They have to make sure that their purposes are in line with the ones set out in the trust and any limitations on their powers as well. So this office structure tells us something important about how we may integrate democratic accountability of the police with their independence. Indeed, I think seen from the right angle, we can see that both of these concerns are aspects of the same fundamental idea, right? That policing is genuinely public, and that therefore the trouble with the American democratic model is that it turns policing into a plaything of a particular set of elected local officials. Mayors or sheriffs get to do pretty much as they would like in the exercise of police powers. That is to say, they're elected, and that's where the democracy and the public nature of it ends. Mayors or sheriff, and the trouble with the traditional English model then is that it doesn't provide a mechanism for getting the public input into the policies that define the office. So the solution to the puzzle lies in the idea of public office and the articulation of clear policies. So rather than electing an individual to administer the police department, so this is one worry with the PCC model, I guess, in England, is you have an individual who's giving directives as opposed to a set of policies which define the office administered by an official. We should instead vote to set down policies for the police that are set down, subject to public debate, capable of review, and persistent, and that allow us to ensure that the police are acting in a way that is consistent with those purposes. So with a clear set of policies in place, police chiefs and their top brass are then in a position to pursue their defining policies even-handedly in accordance with the terms of their office. Since they occupy a public office, this allows for considerably more scrutiny of the manner in which these principles are followed than would be the case if police departments were simply carrying out specific demands from their political superiors. What's more, the accountability of police departments is likely to be more amenable to a meaningful review of their faithfulness to established policies through police body cameras, collection and tabulation of arrests, stop and frisk, that sort of thing. We can look now to the direct application on the beat of policing and its faithfulness to those principles in a way we never could before. So that kind of public review is through technologies made more made possible in a way that it wasn't before. Now, this is, in case you were worrying that I am Panglossian in the extreme here. It's all about that. That's not what I mean. What I'm suggesting is that the idea of public office, I think, is a kind of organizing idea that doesn't solve our problems. What it does is it organizes our problems in a slightly different way, and I hope highlights what's interesting about some of them in a way that may not have been completely salient before. So let me just say three things about that. So the first arises from the conception of policing as a public office, is that it is fundamentally public, right? A point that makes the massive increase in private security and private policing in recent decades tricky. So as you see, as Edner, I don't have your picture on my screen, but you can see it with the flash right here. Remind us a number of years ago, right? There was plenty of private policing long before the creation of the Met, and there's plenty more now. So if policing is fundamentally related to the creation and maintenance of a shared conception of public order, then private actors who carry out these functions should be subject to the same or similar duties and in defining purposes as police officers who explicitly occupy a public office. So even though private police officers are paid by private interests, and that does, I think, inevitably cause conflicts, because whoever pays your paycheck, and particularly where you're on contract, there is a conflict of reasons with public reasons and those that come from the people who are paying your bills, at least can be regulated in a way that pushes us in this direction with guidance from an idea of public office. I have written myself skeptically about a possibility of turning private security officials into anything like suitable enforcers of a public office, a public order. But in the world in which we live now, where it is a fact of life that there are innumerable private enforcement agencies, we can at least add positive duties and public purposes through regulation to them. But more needs to be said about that, lots more. Second point concerns the relationship between policing to a great many other public offices that also have this shared conception of public order as their overarching purpose. So as Patrick Cahoon and many other 18th century scholars made clear, policing in the modern sense, the constabulary, is but one public office among many that targets the same shared conception of public order. So public health, education, housing, and so on, all have the establishment and preservation of a shared conception of public order as their guiding purpose. Nowadays, we hive off policing in the narrow sense from all these others. But what this history tells us is that the separation is always, in a sense, provisional. Should it be police officers or should it be mental health workers who are dealing with a person suffering from a violent mental health crisis? Should it be police officers or public housing officials who are dealing with unhoused people occupying public spaces in the parks or on sidewalks? Should it be police officers or publication and public education and parks and recreation officials who deal with young people on the streets late at night? Although it is wise to have policies in place about best practices on the allocation of responsibility on these matters, I think we have to think about those as defeasible default presumptions that need to give way in the face of circumstances. This is not a neat division of offices in the way that we can do when there is a clearly separate purpose at stake. This is always going to be provisional. The third concerns the many overlapping public orders that policing takes as its defining purpose. So recall the incident with which I began today's talk, right? Those protests in Ottawa, Canada, that brought our capital to a frozen standstill in every sense of that expression 2 years ago. So a small number of people with a large number of trucks was able to shut down ordinary life, preventing, as I said, kids from going to school, ambulance from taking ill people to hospital, and shutting down many of the operations of the national government. We can think of this as a crisis of municipal policing. We can think of this as a local issue of concern to the residents of the neighborhoods where this took place. But we could think of it as a crisis of regional, because Ottawa was also a hub for transportation of goods and so on in the region, or of national significance, since it significantly not only hindered the flow of goods and people, but affected the ability of the national government to operate. So my point here is simply that the scale of public order to which our police efforts should be directed varies considerably. But police departments, and I want to hear more about the situation here in England, because I got some interesting suggestions before this talk. Because in Canada, I would say police departments operate on a single scale of operation, are answerable only to them. And yet the issues they deal with are sometimes neighborhood, sometimes citywide, sometimes regional, sometimes national. And it is essential that our governance structures allow for the adjustment of police operations to the scale of the question that it concerns them. Now, much of the recent American literature on policing has focused on the importance of local democracy as the guarantor of police legitimacy. So Tracy Mears and Dan Kahan at Yale Law School, for example, have argued at great length the power of local community consultation to bind the police to the local community's conception of public order as essential. Now, on some questions, I think they have a point. Some questions are genuinely local, and local community input is extremely important, and especially in the context where they are doing most of their work, where they're talking about urban communities that are racialized and see themselves and are seen by other communities as very separate from wealthy suburban white communities. And so suggesting that we need to pay careful attention to their priorities on a number of questions, I think is incontrovertibly true. But as we saw in Ottawa, right, the same problem of scale goes the other way sometimes. Right? Sometimes it's not that we need to pay attention not to the whole region, but to this neighborhood. Sometimes it's not just to this region, but to the whole country. Right? Questions are of national significance. Our police governance structures need to maintain a clear decision-making structure, sure, but because that, of course, was the other problem with Ottawa, right? Is everyone was running around with their hair on fire doing nothing. No one knew whose decision it was to make. You need a well-defined governance structure, but one with enough flexibility to allow for change in scale as situations require. So it must be within the powers of some officials to recognize this, whether it is a provincial or national cabinet minister, a minister of emergency preparedness, a government board appointed to address these questions. We need some institution capable of recognizing that problem scale. Now, that's all suggestion. That's all sketches. That's all. Here's some questions. I don't provide you with a lot of detailed policy guidance right now. Partly that's because of the kind of thing I do. I'm interested in theoretical questions that frame the debate, but partly it's also because of the kind of embryonic quality of a larger project that I'm involved in here. And so I am going to ask all of you for input because I would learn an enormous amount about, I already have today actually, about governance structures here and how they're responsive to some of these worries, and to the extent to which some of these worries have already been overcome through other mechanisms. But thank you very much for taking the time, and I look forward to some discussion with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Right, the floor is open for questions, comments, and in this case, helpful suggestions.
I think you're here for the